In this lesson, we'll take a look at our final character for this week, and that is the founding father, Patrick Henry, who lived from 1736 to 1799 and represented Virginia. He was a native son of Virginia. And for his nickname, we'll simply use what was applied to him by his contemporaries, and he was called the Cicero of America. Cicero was a famous Roman senator who was known for being able to speak very eloquently, to speak very well, so well that people stopped in their tracks and listened to what he had to say. And Patrick Henry really was no different. He came from a very proud family line. In fact, on his mother's side, they could trace their lineage, their ancestry, all the way back to Alfred the Great, that wonderful king from English history who so wonderfully won independence from the Danes. But he himself, as a boy, Patrick Henry that is, was kind of a poor student. He really didn't actually do the lessons that his parents set out for him. In fact, he called himself illiterate for much of his life. He didn't mean illiterate like, I cannot read. He meant illiterate in the sense that he didn't read. In other words, he had all of this library at his fingertips. He had all this opportunity to read the classics, but he'd rather do something else instead. He'd rather just go and play instead. That's really kind of the difficult thing that we often have, especially in a country like America to this day, is we have so much wealth at our fingertips and so much time often that we often squander it, and we often do not do things that will build us up because they're hard, they're difficult. And Patrick Henry was no different. As a result, he tried farming and failed at that. He later tried shopkeeping, and he also failed at that. He was a failed businessman. So, seeing himself as needing some kind of job, some way to make money, he decided to try the practice of law. And to become a lawyer, like today, you have to be able to pass the bar exam for your state. Virginia had one back then that was probably a little more difficult than the one you take today. Well, Henry began to read all the law books he could get his hands on, and it only took him an amazing 2 months to prepare for the bar exam. He passed it successfully, and it seemed almost as if overnight he became one of the greatest lawyers in his county and eventually in the whole state of Virginia. He was a very diligent, hardworking lawyer who loved the ability to speak and convince people that the cause of his client was just. And in fact, Henry only took cases that he believed were just cases. It made him an incredible lawyer and especially an incredible speaker. As a result, during his lifetime, he would be the governor of Virginia some 5 times. He was so influential that when George Washington became president, he asked Patrick Henry to serve as his Secretary of State. When Henry refused that, he would later ask Henry to serve as the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. Henry also refused that. Not because he somehow didn't like Washington or didn't think that those roles were important or valuable. It was because Henry always saw himself as a Virginian first. He always saw his primary calling and his primary duties to his state of Virginia. It's one of the important streams to understand in the whole history of America is that you got your identity from your local area and especially from your local state, at least until the war between the states. Now, Henry, when 1765 and the Stamp Act occurred, Henry very quickly, who was a member of the Virginia Congress called the House of Burgesses, he very quickly went to the chamber and he gave a speech giving his opinion about the Stamp Act and specifically his opinion about King George. In fact, let me read to you the famous quote that he said. Referring to King George, he said, "Caesar had his Brutus." Brutus, by the way, was the guy who assassinated Caesar. Charles I, his Cromwell. Cromwell, by the way, was the guy who had Charles I's head lopped off. And George III, who was the king at the time, may profit by their example, he said. This is after men in the House of Burgesses began to shout, "Treason! Treason!" because they understood that he was comparing George III to kings of the past who had been killed by their own people for reasons of tyranny. He then said, "If this be treason, make the most of it." It was a very bold statement that came very early on in the struggle for independence. But as a result, it made Henry someone that people listened to because they understood he was not afraid to go to bat for justice by even risking his own life. And because he was so beautiful at giving speeches, because he was so eloquent, people stopped. They actually became silent and they would simply listen to him. For example, his most famous speech, which came on the eve of the War of Independence, is his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, in which he talks about why the British have put so much of their navy and so much of their army over here in the colonies. He said simply, "They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. We have petitioned. We have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne." In other words, he argued that they had already used diplomacy to appeal for their rights as colonists, and they had not only been denied, but they had actually been insulted in the process. He went on to say, "The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Give me liberty or give me death." He took a stand. And that stand, which required an incredible boldness, is really what makes Henry such an incredible character. Now, Henry had an incredible reputation from speeches such as this. There's a famous story or anecdote told about him. It was when the British had come through the capital of Virginia, they had taken over the Congress, and Henry, along with several congressmen, had to flee to the woods. And there in the woods, they found that they really didn't have enough water and they really didn't have any food at all. And so they found an older woman who was chopping firewood outside of her house in the woods. And they said, "We would like to, have food." And she said, "Well, who are you?" And that's when they said, "Well, we are your representatives. We're congressmen, and we have fled the capital because the British would have taken us otherwise." And she said, "Well, my son and my husband are both off fighting the British, and you guys didn't fight them. You just fled like cowards the other way." And that's when Henry said, "Well, you see this guy right here? He's your representative Tyler. Or this guy here, he's your representative Harrison." And she said, "Well, I used to respect you, but now that I know you fled from the capital and fled from the fight, I don't respect you anymore." Well, that's when one of the representatives said, "Well, ma'am, what if I told you that Patrick Henry was here himself?" And the woman said, "I wouldn't believe it. Patrick Henry would never run away from the fight. He's far too bold for that." Of course, he was right there. And that's when the representative Harrison said, "Well, ma'am, this is Patrick Henry right here." And she said, "Really? It's you?" Patrick Henry said, "Yes, it's me in the flesh." And she said, "Well, in that case, come on in and I'll give you supper." And she did. In other words, Henry had an incredible reputation as a bold man who didn't back down unless, in that case, he absolutely had to, and that was only in order to fight for another day. Now, Henry became a champion of decentralized government. He became a champion of a government that had proper checks and balances, which is one of the reasons why Henry actually fought against the Constitution when it came out. The United States already had a government. It was called the Articles of Confederation. And we'll talk about that later. But even so, when Henry saw the Constitution, he realized that this was a new government that had not been approved by the people or even by the states. And so he argued against it. He argued against it with all of his eloquence for days and days and days in the Virginia Congress, that if you look at the records of all the speeches given during that time, some 600 pages of speeches, nearly a quarter of them were given by Henry himself. He almost convinced Virginia to not ratify the Constitution, but he eventually agreed to it when the Bill of Rights was passed. But he also was an incredible champion of faith. Like Samuel Adams, he was a man of prayer who reserved the last hour of every day for prayer, for praying for specific people in his family, for specific neighbors, for specific issues of local government, for specific issues of the church, or specific issues of the national government. His very last work that he wrote, like Samuel Adams, was a defense of Christianity. It's been lost to us because he ordered it burned upon his deathbed. But he made it very clear to his descendants that when he died, he himself was a believer. In fact, he wrote this in his will. He said, "This is all the inheritance I can give to my dear family," referring to his fortune and the farm, which he began in his later days that was very successful. He said, "The religion of Christ can give them one, that is an inheritance, which will make them rich indeed." But perhaps most important about Patrick Henry is Patrick Henry was somebody who thought, kind of like the Puritans, in terms of the end game or the long game. He thought beyond independence. And he wrote this. He said, "Whether the resistance to Britain's tyranny will prove a blessing or a curse will depend upon the use our people make of the blessings which God has bestowed on us. If they are wise, they will be great and happy. If they are of a contrary character, if they're not wise, they will be miserable. Righteousness alone can exalt them as a nation." Something the Founding Fathers always understood was that things like righteousness and faith went hand in hand with national blessing and national success. It's what they always saw when they looked at a struggle like the War of Independence, or particularly how the nation should live after independence.